The Speaker, John Bercow, is going to be picking these votes that are going to be held tonight. How do you think it's going to play out this evening?
Well, I don't think today is going to resolve anything very clearly. I think that Mr. Bercow will first decide that he takes maybe no more than 6 or so resolutions out of the 16 that have been put forward. It is possible that none of them will gain a clear majority, but out of it we might see where a majority might lie if it comes down to just a choice between 2 options. And that means that another vote will be put back to Parliament on Monday next week. That could be a more decisive day. In between, we may very well get Theresa May coming back to Parliament with her withdrawal agreement, which she's agreed with the 27 other members of the EU, saying, OK, you've rejected this twice, but how about now? Will you come on board when the alternative prospect might be a much softer Brexit or no Brexit at all?
Well, what about that idea of a no Brexit? I mean, 6 million people have signed that petition to repeal Article 50 there. Do you see that happening? Do you see a second referendum perhaps on the horizon?
Well, I think outright revocation of Article 50, which is what the petition calls for, would only come about right on the deadline. There is one of the motions today says that Parliament should decide that if within 4 days of the deadline there is no agreement on an alternative deal, then there should be outright revocation. That's just possible, but I think still unlikely. Slightly more likely might be a referendum. There's a sensible proposal that's out there which would be a compromise. It says, look, we will accept Theresa May's withdrawal agreement if it's put to a referendum and confirmed. But of course, that would open the door to that referendum deciding, after all, to remain in the EU and not to leave. So these are both possibilities, but neither is at this stage certain.
What about the Prime Minister herself? How much longer can Theresa May hang on? I mean, she's having a meeting this afternoon with something called the 1922 Committee, where there could be some wheeling and dealing going on. Tell us about that.
Well, the Brexiters, the hardline Brexiters, are trying to push her into announcing that she will resign as soon as the deal goes through, or as soon as the UK has left the EU, so that somebody else can carry on the negotiations in the future. It's a pretty cynical move, and the latest I hear is she might give a heavy hint. She might promise to do that, but only privately. She's not going to come out in public and say, I'm going. She is extraordinary in her stubbornness and her willingness to hang on there, but that's also a big part of the problem, because up till now, she's very stubbornly refused to seriously look for an alternative compromise with other parties than her own. And that's precisely what the Parliament has now taken the initiative on and is putting to Parliament today. We might see the possibility of another compromise, and the big question is, will she accept it?
Just to remind people, of course, the MPs getting to this point already is historic.
Absolutely. It is a constitutional first, really, for the Parliament to not seize power, but certainly seize the initiative from the government and say, look, we're going to put other things on the table. Now, that is precisely what the European Council basically gave them the chance to do last week. Donald Tusk said very clearly, this will allow you 4 options. You could have the deal on the table, you could have no deal, you could have a referendum, a long extension to look for another option, or you could have outright revocation. So the European Council has done a very clever deal, if you like, in opening up the possibilities. But at the end of the day, it's got to be the British Parliament and the British government that reach a conclusion.
Quentin, just to wrap up, what is the feeling like there in the street amongst your colleagues, people you're talking to? How are people feeling at this point so late in the game in regard to the Brexit mess?
Well, it's extraordinary, really. You have seen with this huge demonstration there was in London on Saturday that there's a real a degree of momentum in favour of staying in the European Union. It was, after all, the biggest pro-EU demonstration I think there's ever been in the whole continent. Having said that, there is also a feeling of exhaustion, and I think that people are thinking, oh, for goodness sake, can't we just bring this to an end? But if we actually decide to leave the European Union on April the 12th or whenever it may be, we're going to have another 5 to 10 years of endless negotiations on just what the final agreement and the final relationship will look like. So people have got an awful lot more to go.
Quentin, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Quentin Peel there speaking to us from Chatham House in London.